Okay, we are here to discuss Chapter 27, the Cold War. And here we go on to that. Okay, so Chapter 27, Section 1, Development of the Cold War. The rivalry between the Soviet Union, USSR, Russia, whatever you want to call it, and the United States was the focus of the Cold War. The U.S. Marshall Plan tried to make communism less attractive by providing millions of dollars to rebuild Western Europe. So remember the Marshall Plan, very important. Germany became divided into two states, with a divided city inside of East Germany. Remember, Berlin is inside of East Germany. In 1949, communists took control of China, and the Soviet detonation of the atomic bomb launched the U.S.-Soviet arms race. Soviet and Western alliance systems spanned the globe. The Cuban Missile Crisis presented a frightening prospect of nuclear war. American policymakers perceived non-communist South Vietnam as a domino that must be permitted to fall to communism. Despite the eventual communist victory, the domino theory proved to be unfounded. And we will be skipping the Vietnam section. Now, just so you're aware of what the Cold War is, the Cold War, often dated from 1947 to 91, was sustained state of political and military tensions between the powers of the Western Bloc, dominated by the United States, with NATO among the Allies, and powers of the Eastern Bloc, dominated by the Soviet Union, along with the Warsaw Pact. And you're wondering, what is NATO and the Warsaw Pact? We will get into that. This began after the success of their temporary wartime alliances against Nazi Germany, leaving the USSR and the US as two separate powers with profound economic and political differences. A neutral faction arose with the non-aligned movement founded by Egypt, India, and Yugoslavia. This faction rejected association with either. And if you look there in my picture, you can see the flag to the right, the hammer and the sickle and the star. That is the Soviet flag. You better recognize the one to the left, and the one below belongs to China. And China is still extremely communist today. So, if you look at this particular page, you'll see that we look at the sections of confrontation of the Soviet powers found in Section 1, rivalry in Europe, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, division in Germany. And of course, the rivalry in Europe, Eastern Europe, was an area physically close to the Soviet Union, and after the Nazis had lost power, the Soviet army was in control and did not want to leave. The USSR and Stalin, as its leader, wanted Eastern Europe to be communist. Greece. The communists and anti-communists fought for control of the country. Great Britain helped the anti-communist, sorry about that misspelling, for a while, but it had to leave to support themselves. Why? Because they were becoming a welfare state and needed to keep all of their money to pay for all of the things that were going on inside of Great Britain. The Truman Doctrine, Harry Truman, the President of the United States, who did drop the atomic bomb onto Hiroshima and Nagasaki, said in 1947 that the U.S. would give money to countries threatened by communism, just as in Greece. The U.S. felt that communism would spread faster as more countries fell to communism. The Marshall Plan, in order to combat this, General George Marshall, the Secretary of State, sorry about that, wrote the Marshall Plan, Rebuild Europe. The thinking was that if communists moved into and rebuilt European countries, more would become communists. The Soviet countries refused to participate and saw this as an attempt by Americans to buy support. Well, yes, it is. Duh. But it worked. In response, they had the Comic-Con, not what you visit when you go to San Diego in the summer. In 1949, by 1947, it was clear that there was going to be a battle between the superpowers. What are superpowers again? Military strength and political influence amongst strong countries. Now, if you look at Germany, pay attention to that map as I read there. You can see that Berlin is actually within the country of East Germany, these two countries went against each other in every Olympics at the time. Germany had been divided into 4 zones. 3 of them were owned by France, the USSR, and Great Britain. The USSR opposed this and formed a blockade. Any supplies going into Berlin, the German city, divided in half and located outside of East German Soviet borders. The U.S. and Great Britain had 10-month-long airlift of supplies flying into West Berlin to avoid war with USSR over the blockade. In September 1949, the blockade was finally lifted. And on this particular slide, you can go ahead and look at that area. Which countries of Europe did not choose to be a part of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact? And you can see that there, because if you're looking below, if you look at the key, it says non-member nations, and you can see Austria, Switzerland, Yugoslavia. See all those areas right in there? And then, of course, you can see who is a part of NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization, or the Warsaw Pact. Okay, these are two teams. That's basically what you need to know about these two teams. We have those alliances again, which were, of course, bad for World War I. If you look at this, we're still in Section 1, Development of the Cold War. Non-military alliances, there is NATO. I told you we'd get back to that. Was formed in 1949. Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Netherlands, Great Britain, Italy, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, and Iceland all signed an alliance with the U.S., Canada, eventually West Germany, Turkey, and Greece. The Warsaw Pact had the USSR, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, of course, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Alliances which caused World War I were dividing the world again. In the Korean War, the North was communist versus the South, non-communist, brought the U.S. into a fight to stop the spread of communism. My father participated in that war. Arms race. What is an arms race? Is it when we race on our arms instead of our feet? No, it's countries building up their weapon supply and armies. Both sides believe that an arsenal of weapons would prevent war. So, if my stuff is bigger than your stuff, you'll leave my stuff alone. That's the idea. Both countries had ICBMs. What are those? Intercontinental ballistic missiles. Bombs. Could go anywhere in the world from where they were launched. In 1957, Sputnik was launched by the USSR, showing that they had the ability to get to space, not just other parts of the United States or the world or whatever. Look at that guy right there. His name's Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, known for pounding his shoe on the United Nations as a gavel. He was so in an uproar, wanted to stop the flow of people and goods from West Berlin to East Berlin. In 1961, he said, I have a great idea. Let's build a barrier, just like the Great Wall of China, but through the middle of this city. You see that barrier there. Families were separated. Minefields, machine guns, towers, floodlights. All were in place to stop people from going across. This made for great movies, though. I have to say, as I was growing up, there were always movies about East Berlin and East Germany and the powers that be. Now, looking at this particular map, the reason why I've included it is because I want you to know which countries in the Western Hemisphere were communist. Cuba. Right now, we could add Venezuela to that. Of course, with Hugo Chavez dying, maybe the people will take over and overthrow this concept. Which countries in Asia were communist? Well, we do have North Korea, which is giving us a little bit of problems right now, as you may hear in the news. North Vietnam, and of course, China. Okay, so those are some of those areas that you could see on that particular map. Then what you guys can see on the next map is you can see what's going to happen with the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a time in history when World War III almost began. The Soviets were mad because the U.S. had missiles near their border in Turkey and declined and decided to move nuclear weapons near the U.S. border. To Cuba, which had recently become communist. The leader of course, Cuba is Fidel Castro. He is still there. His brother, I believe, is named Nick, but I'm not sure. Anyway, Fidel Castro took over Cuba, and America used to have quite a huge interest in Cuba. Cuba had a lot of rum, in fact. But after that point, when they had the revolution and they had Fidel Castro in power, we broke off relations with them. So Cuba allowed Nikita Khrushchev to move weapons there. And the president, so Nikita Khrushchev and the president, John F. Kennedy, went back and forth in tense negotiations in October of 1962. for 13 days, the world stood on the brink of war or disaster. There's actually a movie called 13 Days. And so you can see exactly how close that is. And one of your questions will actually be John F. Kennedy's report of what was going on during that time. And this particular slide right here just gives you kind of a look at the breakdown of some of these days and what was going back and forth. There were actually, I can only imagine now, maybe it's Twitter accounts, Facebook, or emails, but back then it was letters going back and forth between the two leaders saying, hey, if you don't do this, I'll do this. If you do this, I'll do this. Let's solve this. Nobody wanted war. It would be total earth annihilation. So they did want to solve this problem, but they both had something that needed to be solved. Finally, in the end, what happened? The U.S. agreed to remove the weapons from Turkey. And then Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the weapons from Cuba. And we stopped that process. So here we have our summary of section 1, and you can see the 3 different questions there that might be asked of you on the review section. Okay, so section 2 states, after World War II, Stalinist economic policies brought dramatic economic growth, but at a high cost. Most of the growth was in heavy industry. Consumer goods remained hard to find. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, condemned Stalinist terror. Terror, that's a minor word for a big offense, increased the production of consumer goods and loosened controls on writers, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Khrushchev's rash decisions, such as the plan to place missiles in Cuba, convinced colleagues to remove him from office in 1964. After World War II, Soviet forces had occupied all of Eastern Europe and part of the Balkans. The occupied states now became the Soviet satellites. Yugoslavia was the exception and developed into an independent communist state. In Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, attempts for reform threatened Soviet domination. In each case, the Soviet Union crushed these reforms by using threats of military force, which is a polite way of saying the army invaded. Okay, so what we have here on our slide is the hammer and sickle, the flag, basically. And you see the CCCP? Yeah, that's what we call it, but in Russia, it's SSSR. And that is the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. So we have the hammer, stands for industrial working class. The sickle stands for the agricultural workers. Get it? Use a sickle when you harvest wheat. The star, the 5-pointed red star, is a symbol of communism, as well as broader socialism in general. It is sometimes understood to represent the 5 fingers of the worker's hand. And the red, everything is red, red, red. The red army, the red this, the red that. Okay, so that's what you get from communism as we look at it in section 2. So you can see on this particular slide, we have the timeline of socialist or of Soviet leaders. Stalin, the good, the bad, the ugly. Stalin is a scary man. He is just as scary as Hitler. He could have killed more. They say between 30 and 40 million people basically went missing, were sent to different concentration camps. We'll call them that. Call them work camps, call them relocation camps, call them what you want to, but they were located in Siberia. Some people think that he did die from a stroke, but some people think he was starting to go crazy a little bit before that with some paranoid stuff. Production increased to 40% of pre-war levels. New power plants, canals, and factories were built. The economy recovered. But at what cost? The bad, housing shortages. When I was there, most people lived in apartments, and they called these things dachas, where they would go to homes and they were on the countrysides. And it was amazing because I went to this place in St. Petersburg where these homes had been abandoned since communism had begun. I wonder what's happened to them since then, because they were gigantic and beautiful and out on this place called Green Rock Island or something like that. Anyhow, he was suspicious of people around him. Everything had to be approved by the government. Books, movies were censored. Look at the picture to the right. There's Stalin. And what they do before Photoshop, they Photoshopped the guy out. So it was very much a government that was controlled, and you did not know what was happening. And you guys don't understand that because you live in a very free society. Stalin eliminates possibly 30 to 40 million people. So then you could see from the timeline, you see Stalin there, and they have a little bit of in-betweenness of a few people, but basically Khrushchev comes to power after that. They say Khrushchev was in the building when Stalin died, and that possibly, they don't know if somebody killed Stalin. He was a bad dude, so why not kill him, I suppose. 1956 began the process of desalinization, which is the elimination of some of Stalin's ruthless policies. He loosened the government controls on literature, allowing Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work to be published. He tried to increase agriculture but failed. The industrial growth rate slowed under his command. He placed missiles in Cuba, causing the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in 1964, after Kennedy's death, he was on vacation and Soviet leaders voted him out of power and forced him into retirement. Wow, what a terrible vacation that must have been, to come back and find that you have been fired. Okay, the next slide from this section. Section 2, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, communist patterns of control. East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and Hungary, and the communists held control after World War II. Czechoslovakia lost control to the Soviets in 1948. Albania became communist, but were independent of the USSR. Yugoslavia, Josip Broz, known as Tito, was the leader of Yugoslavia. Communist government, but was not controlled by Stalin. So you can see all of these areas in Eastern Europe that were communist by looking at the map below. Revolts against communism? The Soviets took advantage of Eastern Europe and exploited their resources and made living conditions bad for them. Basically, they were the playground bully. After Stalin's death, many tried to become independent of the USSR. And you see Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia there. So Hungary, on November 1st of 1956, Emir Nagy promised free elections, but 3 days later, Khrushchev, the Soviet army, attacked and Nagy was executed 2 years later. In Poland, October 1956, Władysław Gomułka, reforms were adopted, but remained loyal to the Warsaw Pact. And then in Czechoslovakia, Antonín Novotný was in power and known as Little Stalin, so he'll stay in power, not until January 1968, when Alexander Dubček was elected, did reform come, but only lasted until August when the Soviet army came in, attacked, and crushed these particular reforms. Now, I have to say that I was in 1992, I had gone to Russia, and when we talk about some of the things that the Soviets had done, they took over the, as you look at this slide with the answers on it, they took over the all the stuff that Hitler had stolen from all over Europe. Then the Soviets got to Berlin, and they took all of the stuff that he had stolen and took it back into Moscow and St. Petersburg, which of course was not called St. Petersburg, but called Leningrad. But believe it or not, it's back to being called St. Petersburg now. So basically, I was able to see in the Hermitage, which is the summer palace, winter palace of Alexander the Great. Winter palace. Amazing. I have no words. It's amazing, the art that was there. As we slide into third, this is the third section of this chapter and the final one. In the 1950s and 60s were periods of dramatic economic growth in Western Europe. France and West Germany both experienced rapid economic recoveries. In Great Britain, dire economic conditions forced Winston Churchill from power. The new Labour government set out to create modern welfare state. Does that even sound good? And began to dismantle the British Empire. The formation of the European Economic Community created a powerful new trading bloc. Canada emerged as an industrial economy, and the United States in the New Deal had brought a long and industrial economy. The United brought a long-term increase in the power of the federal government, prosperity of the Cold War. Suspicions defined the United States in the 1950s. Civil rights and the expansion of the New Deal were defining issues in the 1960s. Students protested, blah, blah, blah. Yes, students protested. Women did get more rights. Well, they asked for more rights. So as you can see, this particular slide, section 3, France, West Germany, and Great Britain. So look at Charles de Gaulle down there. He felt that he led the French Fourth Republic, a strong parliament, weak presidency. Sadly, government was ineffective. In 1958, he drafted a new constitution for the Fifth Republic, giving the president power
to appoint a prime minister. He was the first president of the Fifth Republic. He invested heavily in nuclear weapons. And France's economy grew faster than the United States. West Germany. Federal Republic of Germany was West Germany. It was controlled by France, the United States, and Great Britain. Had an amazing economic recovery as compared to that after World War I. Remember, everything after World War I in Germany caused them to basically go into World War II. The Marshall Plan was working. Unemployment went from 8% to 0.0%. Imagine us now. They say we're at 7%, but Las Vegas is at about 12%. The leaders of the country were still known as chancellors. In the 1960s, there was an economic downturn, and the Socialist Party became powerful, but nothing like the Nazis. In Great Britain, the two-party system, Labour and Conservatives. Churchill was a conservative, lost power to the war, or after the war. The people wanted a welfare state. I don't get that. Where the government takes care of them instead of them taking care of themselves. Makes no sense. Nobody likes to be told what to do, even if they're getting free stuff. National insurance and health systems were put into place. Cost so much money that Great Britain lost the worldwide power because it had to spend money at home. Due to the financial problems, the Conservatives were brought back into power, but the changes had been made, and by then the people liked them, and they actually didn't want to change too much. So I slid in a slide here of a little bit of fashion for the ladies from the 50s and the 60s. Look at those hemlines change going up the leg. That's what you need to see because women's roles change. And I guess as they get a little bit more power, they get a little bit more risque in their fashion. Back to politics. Here is a map of Western Europe during this time. You guys can see the way those two areas are. And then we will look at this section in right there where we get to look at the United States in the 50s, 60s, the development of Canada, and the emergence of a new society. I have kind of cut through some of this stuff, but the 50s, we still had FDR's New Deal giving more power to the federal government, which is kind of sad. Several Democratic presidents were elected and the economy was good. Real wages, like the actual amount you make, was increased every year by 3%. Many children were born and became known as baby boomers. Became known as the baby boomer generation because of the large increase in birth rate following the war. All those men came home and everybody got ready, busy, I guess. You can see the birth rate to the right in my scale right there. Because of the large increase in birth rate following the war, fear of communism spread, and Joseph McCarthy, known as McCarthyism, boy, he would put people from Hollywood on trial. Anybody that he thought was a communist, he somehow put them on trial, which seems crazy now because it seems like you should be a communist if you want to be a communist. In the 1960s, really a lot has been written about this time, and you guys will get more about this time when you're in U.S. history. So you talk about the Kennedys and Camelot, and then he's assassinated, and then his brother comes to power, and just before that we get this great civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King gets assassinated just before my birthday on April 2nd, and then just after that in July, when Bobby Kennedy is running for the presidency in 1968, he is also assassinated. So it was just this time of upheaval. And all of the people that were hippies were just not wanting to have the values and morals of their parents. They wanted something different. And so they protested, and they protested the Vietnam War, which the Vietnam War is another huge thing in U.S. history. And you'll study more about that in U.S. history. Oh, sorry about the development of Canada being a little bit small. Just like Great Britain, they created a welfare state. They decided that they were going to pay for the people in their country instead of having the people in the country make their own decisions. They enacted the national social security system and a health plan. The Liberal Party, with Lester Pearson as its leader, made these changes. And then the emergence of a new society. The middle class grew addicted and added new jobs. So basically, like if you had this middle class and it was just like teachers and firemen and policemen, now they had kind of like
kind of like if we did it today, like a technology support group, which would be considered the middle class. Okay. So we added more jobs to that area, which is great. You know, you're not just somebody poor, you're not somebody rich. You get to be in the middle. Let's see. Consumer society began where people were purchasing more goods, not for what they need, but for what they want. Smaller family size. So we're not like going, hey, I need to have 12 kids because I need, 11 of them to live and 10 of them to take care of me when I'm old. Smaller family size led to women wanting to work and experiencing work during World War II helped them also want to experience work, but women were paid less than men and were still considered, look at that, less than men. In 1960s in Europe and the U.S. were known for their protests. And yes, it was very sad that women were paid less, because now I am not. This is the baby boomer generation. So you guys can see, here is the baby boomer generation, and here is where some of you guys are born. So when they talk about us running out of money in the United States because the baby boomers are retiring, getting sick, dying, whatever, you can imagine they say it's something like 10,000 baby boomers a day are retiring or feeding off of the Social Security system, and that the Social Security system is going to go broke because there's just too many baby boomers. And so you can imagine with the birth rate, like there's more people capable of giving birth right now, but reality is there were more babies being born at that time per 1,000. So that's just, that's really amazing. And so by now you guys have kind of cruised around and looked at these responses for the end of section 3. So I hope this was helpful.